Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Sidwell had always been a master of invisibility, a man who thrived in the folds between light and shadow, where names were whispered but never written, where truths were known only in half measures and evidence dissolved before it could be traced. In Port Charles, his reputation was that of a phantom kingmaker, someone whose influence could be felt in the city's most shocking events, even if his fingerprints never appeared on a single piece of evidence. He was a predator who understood the value of patience, circling his prey for years if necessary, feeding on their vulnerabilities, and striking only when the odds were stacked entirely in his favor. For Sidwell, the custody battle between Michael and Willow was not just a legal proceeding, it was a chessboard, and every move was a potential weapon. From the moment news of the custody dispute reached his ears, Sidwell began gathering intelligence. His network was vast and diverse. Retired judges who owed him favors, private investigators who lived off his retainer fees, informants planted deep within the courthouse staff, and even a few lawyers willing to trade information for the right price. Within days, he had a full picture of the case, Michael's legal strategy, Willow's emotional instability under pressure, and the subtle but critical fact that Judge Eva Heron would preside over the final hearing. That last detail was the key that unlocked the entire operation. Eva Heron had built her career on the image of incorruptibility. She was a jurist who had made enemies in the political world by refusing to bend to lobbying or financial persuasion. She spoke often about her duty to the law, wore her moral code like armor, and projected the image of a woman immune to the temptations that brought others down. To the public, she was unshakable. To Sidwell, she was a puzzle, because in his experience, everyone had a fault line. All it took was finding it and pressing hard enough. He set his operatives on her, and the results came back in weeks, not months. Beneath her flawless public image was a mess of personal and financial ruin. Several high-risk investments had collapsed in rapid succession, draining her accounts and leaving her teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Worse, her only son, a young man with a taste for excess and poor judgment, was facing serious legal trouble. He was one court date away from potential jail time, and the legal fees alone were enough to keep Eva awake at night. Sidwell had seen this pattern before, the principled official backed into a corner, desperation mounting, conscience eroding one compromise at a time. When he finally approached her, it wasn't with the crudeness of threats or blackmail. Sidwell was far too skilled for that. Instead, he framed his offer as a rescue. He spoke of understanding the pressures of family, of wanting to help without strings attached. The money, substantial enough to erase her debts and secure her son's freedom, would be routed through layers of offshore accounts and intermediaries, so clean that no auditor could trace it back to him. All he asked in return was that, when the custody ruling came, she find in favor of Michael, granting him full custody of the children. Eva resisted. At first. She clung to her principles, her voice trembling with the weight of her own convictions. But Sidwell knew better than to push too hard too soon. He allowed her to sit with the offer, knowing that every day brought another overdue notice, another call from her son's attorney, another reminder of the quicksand she was sinking into. It was only a matter of time. When she finally called him back, her tone was different, hollow, resigned. The deal was struck. The hearing came and went like clockwork. Michael's legal team presented their case with confidence, but even they were surprised when Eva handed down a ruling that was more decisive than they had dared hope for. Full custody to Michael, limited visitation for Willow, and strict conditions for any future custody reviews. Michael was stunned but relieved, convinced that his airtight case and credibility as a father had won the day. Willow, on the other hand, was blindsided, her shock turning into a quiet, simmering fury as she realized how thoroughly the judgment had shut her out of her children's lives. For Sidwell, the outcome was merely the first move in a much larger strategy. He didn't care who raised the children, they were pawns, useful only because of the emotional and political weight they carried. What he wanted was the chain reaction that this ruling would set in motion. If the story could be shaped to suggest that Sonny, Michael's father, had been behind the bribe to secure custody, the scandal would be seismic. Sonny's reputation as a community figure and businessman would shatter. His grip on the docks, already threatened by the upcoming Proposition C vote, would weaken to the point of collapse. If the proposition passed, Sonny would be forced to sell the waterfront properties that anchored his empire, leaving his organization vulnerable and exposed. The only flaw in this plan was that Eva Heron was still alive. As long as she lived, she could change her mind, go to the authorities, or make a confession in some misguided attempt at redemption. Sidwell had learned long ago that the most dangerous element in any scheme was the person holding the truth who thought they still had a choice. Eliminating her wasn't just a precaution, it was a necessity. But Sidwell didn't intend to have her silenced in some sloppy, obvious manner. No, her death had to be art. It had to tell a story so compelling that no one would question it. He envisioned a suicide, tragic, believable, and timed perfectly to inflict maximum damage. The note would be the centerpiece, a carefully forged confession in her own handwriting, detailing how Sonny had coerced her into taking a bribe, how the guilt had become unbearable, and how she could no longer live with the weight of her crime. The handwriting would be flawless, the paper aged just enough to suggest it had been hidden for weeks, and the language crafted to echo Eva's real manner of speaking. Sidwell began pulling in specialists, people who could stage a death scene so meticulously that even seasoned investigators would see nothing amiss. The plan called for subtlety, no signs of a struggle, no suspicious toxicology, just a plausible scenario of a woman undone by guilt. The body would be found in her home, the note prominently displayed, the circumstances suggesting that her moral collapse had finally consumed her. Once the news broke, the fallout would be immediate. The police would connect the dots between her confession and the timing of Michael's custody win. Reporters would descend on Sonny like vultures, dredging up every past accusation, every rumor, every shadow in his history. Political allies would distance themselves, business partners would panic, and the very people Sonny had once protected would see him as a liability. Michael himself might begin to wonder if his father had engineered the victory, turning gratitude into suspicion and suspicion into resentment. Sidwell could see it all as clearly as if it had already happened, the press conferences, the investigations, the whispered betrayals in backrooms across the city. Port Charles would be thrown into chaos, and in that chaos, Sidwell would move unseen, furthering his control while others tore each other apart. He would not simply win, he would reshape the battlefield so completely that his enemies wouldn't even realize they had been defeated until it was far too late. And through it all, Sidwell would remain what he had always been, a shadow in the corner of the room, watching, calculating, and waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Sidwell's plan to remove Judge Eva Heron evolved into something far more than an act of elimination. It became a meticulously engineered psychological drama, a performance staged for the city of Port Charles with a single goal, to rewrite the public's understanding of truth. He knew the most effective assassinations were not carried out with bullets or blades, but with stories that seemed to write themselves in the minds of those who wanted to believe them. If the right seeds were planted, the public would tend the narrative on their own, watering it with speculation and fear until it grew into something monstrous and self-sustaining. From the moment he resolved that Eva could not be allowed to live, Sidwell began sketching the architecture of her demise in his mind with the precision of a master builder. A simple death would never do. It had to be drenched in context, steeped in meaning, dripping with the illusion of moral tragedy. It had to feel inevitable. The suicide narrative was perfect because it invited empathy as well as scandal. It would disarm suspicion while ensuring that her death would be seen as a direct consequence of the alleged bribe. And crucially, it would make Sonny the villain of the story without Sidwell ever having to name him directly. The suicide note would be the cornerstone. Sidwell envisioned it in detail before a single word was written. It would begin with a tone of weary confession, building gradually to a crescendo of self-condemnation. It would describe the moral compromise in vivid detail, how Eva had been approached, how she had resisted at first, and how Sonny's influence had backed her into a corner she could not escape. It would name no accomplices other than Sonny, carefully omitting any suggestion that anyone else had been involved. The handwriting would be her own, or rather, an indistinguishable replica of it. Sidwell had already secured the services of a forger whose work had fooled government agencies. This forger would study months of Eva's notes, court annotations, and even her private grocery lists to mimic not only her script but the subtle rhythm of her phrasing, the slight slant of her lines, the hesitation before certain letters. The note, however, would only be the first act in the story. Sidwell understood that a confession meant nothing if it stood alone. It had to be supported by a lattice of corroborating evidence. He began designing this lattice with a ruthless eye for believability. There would be recorded phone calls, made from disposable numbers, in which a voice that sounded remarkably like Sonny's would be heard speaking in vague but incriminating terms about keeping the judge in line. These clips would be stitched together from hours of unrelated recordings, culled from sources Sidwell had been collecting for years. There would be anonymous tips to select journalists, each one offering just enough information to sound credible but not so much that the entire picture emerged too quickly. The witnesses were perhaps his boldest touch, individuals chosen for their ability to appear ordinary, trustworthy, unconnected to him. They would remember seeing Sonny meet with Eva in dimly lit restaurants or quiet corners of the courthouse parking lot, always in the days leading up to the custody decision. Each would tell a slightly different version of events, but the core details would match just enough to seem authentic. Timing was everything. Sidwell knew the moment of release had to be choreographed with the precision of a symphony. Within hours of Eva's death being discovered, the note would surface in a sealed envelope found among her personal effects. Almost simultaneously, the witness accounts would reach the ears of investigative reporters. The phone recordings would be leaked to a gossip site with a history of accuracy in its scoops, ensuring they would spread through social media like wildfire. The convergence of these elements would overwhelm the narrative, flooding the public consciousness so quickly that no competing explanation could gain traction. The fallout, Sidwell knew, would be catastrophic. Sonny would find himself under siege from every angle. Law enforcement, the press, political adversaries, and even those within his own organization who had always secretly doubted him. His public image would erode by the hour, his business operations would be scrutinized, and the pressure could force him into mistakes that Sidwell could later exploit. The collateral damage to Michael was a bonus. Even if the courts revisited the custody case and stripped him of his win, the greater wound would be personal. The creeping suspicion that his father had corrupted the legal system for his benefit. That suspicion, once seated, would fester, eroding the bond between father and son until it was beyond repair. The Corinthos family, so often united against external threats, would fracture along fault lines Sidwell himself had widened. Meanwhile, Willow moved through her days unaware that she was merely another piece in Sidwell's grand design. She maintained her public image as a loving, wronged mother, a victim of judicial bias, while privately carrying the memory of her own morally questionable actions that had driven Sasha and Daisy out of town. To the casual observer, she was pitiable, perhaps even admirable in her resilience. To Sidwell, she was useful cover. Her conviction that she had lost fairly, if unjustly, meant she would not look for the invisible hand that had guided the judge's decision. Michael, for his part, was beginning to assemble his own theory about Willow, suspecting her involvement in the stalking of Daisy. But without hard evidence, without Sasha or Daisy present to testify, his attention remained fixed on her past rather than on the possibility of external manipulation in his victory. This diversion of his focus suited Sidwell perfectly. The less Michael questioned the origins of his win, the more time Sidwell had to complete the next phases of his plan. In Sidwell's mind, the entire sequence played out like a perfectly choreographed dance, Eva's death as the opening step, the eruption of scandal as the sweeping turn, Sonny's isolation as the slow spiral downward. When the moment came, every piece would fall into place, not because Sidwell forced them, but because he had designed the environment in which they could fall only one way. And when the city turned on itself, devouring its own in the frenzy of scandal, Sidwell would be nowhere to be found. He would be watching from the shadows, just as he always had, the quiet architect of chaos, already mapping out the next game before this one had even reached its end. Sidwell's contingency planning was not simply a safety net. It was a parallel war plan, a fully realized secondary operation that could be deployed at any moment to preserve his position and, if necessary, transform a potential defeat into an even greater victory. He did not merely prepare for the possibility of failure, he engineered scenarios where failure itself could become another calculated step toward his endgame. To Sidwell, a strategy that did not account for collapse was no strategy at all, and every line of retreat he designed was crafted with the same ruthless precision as the attack itself. At the heart of this defensive web was the Willow confession recording, a potent piece of leverage that he treated as both weapon and shield. Sidwell understood the deep human flaw that lived in every public scandal: attention span. When the collective focus of a city like Port Charles was fixed on one fire, the sudden eruption of a second blaze, equally sensational, would scatter that focus, forcing people to split their outrage, doubt, and energy between competing narratives. If his carefully staged Eva Heron's suicide ever began to unravel under scrutiny, if suspicion threatened to drift toward him, he could unleash the recording like a thunderclap, redirecting the storm entirely toward Willow. The brilliance of this plan lay in how little Sidwell himself would appear to be involved. He had already seeded Michael's environment with subtle hints, crumbs of information designed to draw him closer to uncovering the confession, by accident. An overlooked flash drive slipped into a drawer in an office Michael might one day search, a conveniently mislabeled folder stored among case notes he was bound to review. Sidwell made sure that, at the right moment, Michael could stumble across the damning audio as though it were fate. The emotional weight of such a discovery would be immense. Michael, torn between his distrust of Willow and his own moral compass, would wrestle with what to do, but Sidwell counted on the inevitability of human nature. Once in possession of such a weapon, Michael would be unable to resist using it. And when Michael used it, the chain reaction would ignite instantly. Media outlets, some of which had unknowingly been cultivated by Sidwell's quiet influence for years, would receive unverified but credible copies of the confession from multiple anonymous sources at once, making it impossible to trace its origin. He had prepared the press to see Willow not as a grieving mother wronged by the system, but as a manipulator skilled at exploiting sympathy. Over the past months, he had fed select journalists morsels of rumor and innuendo. Nothing overt enough to be actionable, but enough to sit in the subconscious, ready to blossom into full-blown suspicion when the recording hit the airwaves. The confession itself would be a masterclass in incrimination. Whether real or fabricated, it would be edited for maximum emotional and legal impact, structured so that every word suggested guilt without ambiguity. Sidwell had even ensured that ambient background sounds, doors closing, muffled footsteps, distant traffic, would place the conversation in plausible locations, making it feel authentic to anyone who heard it. By the time the public began debating whether it was real, the damage would already be done. This secondary scandal would not exist in isolation. Sidwell's network of intermediaries, the same shadow agents who had been instrumental in building the case against Sonny, would immediately pivot to amplify the new narrative. They would flood online forums, social media threads, and local call-in shows with outrage over Willow's betrayal, demanding justice, questioning her parental fitness, and speculating on whether her custody battle had been driven by ulterior motives. Some of these operatives would pose as concerned citizens, others as insiders, in the know, each lending a different texture to the same overarching story. The effect would be like hundreds of voices shouting in unison, drowning out any remaining discourse about Eva's death. Sidwell had even accounted for the possibility that law enforcement might attempt to track the leak of the recording. The intermediaries were ghosts by design, people with no direct ties to him, each compensated in ways that could never be traced. Some were seasoned professionals with immaculate false identities. Others were desperate individuals plucked from far outside Port Charles, given just enough training to carry out their role before disappearing into new lives in other cities. If one of them was ever caught, there would be nothing to connect them to Sidwell. They were expendable pawns, and they knew it. And yet, all of this, the recording, the press manipulation, the phantom operatives, was only the backup. The primary plan remained the staging of Eva Heron's suicide, and the subsequent destruction of Sonny Corinthos's reputation. Sidwell's genius lay in the way these two operations could overlap seamlessly, each reinforcing the other if needed. In one scenario, the confession could serve as a diversion, pulling attention away from flaws in the Eva narrative. In another, it could be used as an accelerant, painting a picture of a custody battle so poisoned by corruption and deceit that the entire Corinthos family appeared morally bankrupt.